Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 125. And this episode, we are joined by the creator of the recently released, or recently as of when this episode drops, the wonderful game Citizen Sleeper from Jump Over the Age Games. We are joined by Gareth, Damian, Martin. Gareth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're so excited to have you here. Citizen Sleeper is one of those games where I saw the trailer. I don't know if it was in a Nintendo Indie World or during one of the...
It was the PC Gamer Show.
Oh, it was the PC Gamer Show, yeah. And I saw it, and I'm like on a Discord call with a bunch of friends, and I just went, I need to play this game. I don't know that much about. I need to play this game.
I don't remember how long after that happened. I wasn't on that Discord call, but you were hounding me.
I was. Thank
you, though.
I grew up playing a lot of board games and tabletop, and of course, especially over the recent years, I've fell in love with a lot of visual novels, and so this game absolutely captured me from that first trailer. So to start, I wanted to ask, where did the inspiration for Citizen Sleeper come from? Were you someone who played a lot of tabletop and dice-based games or play a lot of visual novels? Where did the inspiration that led to that creation come from?
It's a bit of a mix, really, because when I was making my first game in Other Waters, I kind of started to get into contemporary role-playing games. I started by listening to actual play podcasts like Friends at the Table, and I kind of discovered very quickly that role-playing games had changed quite a lot since I was a teenager and tried to play Dungeons and Dragons and hated all the maths.
3.5 has so much math.
Yeah, and I was just like, this is just not for me. I'm also not really a trad fantasy kind of person, right. So I was just kind of like, okay, yeah, this is a thing that exists in the world, but it's not really my thing. But yeah, Blades in the Dark especially was a book I picked up, and I was just like, wow, this is so cool. I mean, I love Dishonored, so I was just immediately like, okay, this is a cool world that I love. But the rules just fascinated me, especially the way in which you can kind of build out a set of factions and potential events, and then the player can navigate that. So I started running a Blades in the Dark game for my little brother, because he was the only person who I knew who had any interest in playing role-playing games. And so we ran a solo game, and then we ran another game of Blades in the Dark where we ran a game of the Quiet Year beforehand and invented our own setting and did a kind of sci-fi Blades in the Dark. And I was doing this all at the time of making In Other Waters. And making In Other Waters in the daytime and kind of having to design narrative systems and having to plan everything out. And then in the nighttime, running these games and just being wow, the most incredible stuff is just coming out of nowhere here. This feels so free in comparison to the making a video game. I was like, okay, there has to be a way to square this circle. There has to be a way to bring these two things together and somehow bring influences, because I was also amazed by how few contemporary RPGs in the video game space take influence from all the amazing work that's being done in the tabletop space. Yeah. And so I was like, wow, no one's doing this. No one's tried to make a Blades in the Dark video game. Why don't I be the first person to try and make a Blades in the Dark video game? So that was that was definitely where the tabletop side of things came from.
I can see that. It's very clear the influences are on the sleeve. And yeah, it's funny because a lot of RPGs, I think, claim to or seem to borrow from traditions of tabletop gaming, but I think they're borrowing from very different traditions than you are. There is still the random element, and it is a lot of sword and sorcery, or those are the ones that go far more tabletop, whereas there is a very rich history of sci-fi, of cyberpunk, of all of those other avenues and areas. And I do appreciate in playing this game how open the dice rolls are.
Yeah.
And your utilization of them. And that is very much like a lot of different systems that are out there. When did you decide that okay, the dice rolls do need to be out there, do need to be visible to the player in a choice that you make?
So I think that is what caught me actually about contemporary tabletop role-playing games, is that, because you're right, it's true that RPGs are obviously massively influenced by tabletop. They come from tabletop, but there's this kind of decision been made in the past where it's well, the dice were just a functional system, and so if we're putting this on a computer, the dice can be done by the computer, and we don't need to care about the dice. We can just hide them,
right?
And that's the right way to treat dice. But the thing that I love about Blades, especially, is the way, or Forged in the Dark games generally, because there's tons of them now, but is this idea that you expose the dice are very exposed, and they can be the dice pools and the dice results can be manipulated by players, and everything can be negotiated by players. And there's a lot of push and pull that happens in Blades in the Dark. And I found that to be super exciting. And I found that, especially like systems like, I mean, also I took clocks from Blades in the Dark because I love that feeling of, rather than all games have events that are being triggered in the background, but the idea of exposing the systems to the player gives them the chance to actually interact with them and influence them. And so it gives a very, very tangible sense of interaction for the player, I think, that Citizen Sleeper is not the first game to have kind of like timers counting down to events.
Right.
But the difference is the timers are right there and they're literally like timers and you know how many turns till it happens. And I think that just really interested me because I think it opens up a different kind of choice to the kind of choice that maybe video games are used to offering, which is often kind of like dialogue choice or like Paragon Renegade, right? Or like kill or spare. And that's not how I feel, especially, there's this other side of the game, right? Which is the game is very much about a specific experience of struggling and pushing against systems. And I think, in those situations, you don't make choices by like just saying to somebody, like, I like you, I don't like you, or like, like kill or spare. Like nobody ever gets to do a kill or spare in real life.
Not really, no.
But we make decisions by turning up or by like missing deadlines, right? Like that's one of the ways that a lot of things happen to us in life. We miss or make deadlines and we turn up for friends or for jobs or for, situations, or we don't, we go to that wedding we're invited to, or we don't go to it. That affects our life. And so to me, that felt like a really organic way for players to choose, is to just choose through prioritization, because that's how we choose in life. And so it just feels, and that's something that I noticed at the table as well. It's like when you're running a game of Blades of the Dark, so a player will be like, well, I hate the red sashes. Like, I want to go fight the red sashes. Or they're like, I want to take this bit of turf because that will help my smuggling operation. And so I'm going to go do that. And there's that wonderful sense of flexibility that then kind of snowballs into interesting events. And that was what I was kind of trying to capture a little bit of.
You definitely do. So I play a lot of tabletop games. I'm in 2 current games right now. One of them is a Strahd game, classic D&D, fight the vampires. And my character in that tends to be kind of bullheaded. I kind of bumble my way forward into events. And something I learned in Citizen Sleeper so fast is that you can do that too. And when the first timer runs out very early in the game, where your first antagonist kind of confronts you, I believe it's Ethan, is like someone who's tracking you and you don't know why. And that happened. I went, shit, I totally forgot about this. Oh no. And like my brain is like, oh no, is this a game over? Is this guy going to kill me? And it turns out, of course, through the narrative, that like there's more to it than that. It's more complicated than this life or death. But like I was just kind of like, oh, I'll just put dice wherever I want. Let's see what happens. And then like got confronted with that, and so that made me very aware of the timers pretty early. And I'm curious, are those kinds of design choices intended? Like you wanted to give some kind of consequence early to kind of teach people without like giving them a little penalty, without actually like making them die or like start over.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I designed a lot of this stuff in the way that I run a game. So actually the original vertical slice, like the original kind of prototype version of the game, I put that hunted clock in, and I had no idea what would happen when that clock finished, because the demo ends when the clock finishes. And I have a little scene where you're just like, at the end of the demo, it was like, I found you, sleeper, and then you don't see who they are, and it's like end of demo. And I was like, I just know that this is going to work, because I know from running games that having a clock ticking around in the background, and you call it something evocative like hunted, like that creates pressure, whether or not that pressure is earned or real or whatever. It's kind of like, it's something you can trust. And so, I kind of like left that open for a little while, and then I kind of thought about what kind of character I wanted there, and then I put that character in. But all the time when I was working on these kind of design structures, I was trying to, what I call kind of pre-GM the game. I was trying to account for, okay, what might the player do here? And how can I make that interesting? And if I couldn't make it interesting, then I didn't allow the choice to happen, basically. I didn't want it to be, like you say, I didn't want it to be like, oh, you weren't paying attention to that timer, game over, go back to the start, because that you can't do that in a tabletop game either. Like, you'd never want to do that. You're always trying to keep the player alive. You're always trying to keep your players rolling somehow, and you're trying to keep interesting things happening. And I think Blades, for example, really stretches GMs for that, because it's constantly making bad things happen. You basically, every roll, the inevitable thing is you succeed, but there's a consequence. And so you're
Right.
constantly having to throw consequences at the player, but also not overwhelm them. And so that was something that I really wanted this game to have, is that feeling of like, oh, there are consequences here. There is a consequence, but the game is not going to drown you. You can trust it that like it will keep giving you story. Like the story will keep being told. And but the game maybe has less choice than some other video game RPGs, because I didn't want to just say, oh, you've got a free hand at all times, because that also didn't really fit with the narrative and the idea of what position you're in as a sleeper. But it
Absolutely.
also didn't necessarily lead to interesting outcomes, just giving a free choice to players.
I find that, yeah, in a lot of RPG settings, particularly video game RPGs, that having that level of a curated course often makes for better stories because, yeah, you can kind of choose within that. But like you said, in real life, it feels like infinite choice, but it isn't quite as infinite as one would think. But in terms of pre-GMing, which I love that term so much, I am such a seat of your pants game master whenever I run games. So it's like, what is that like? But in sort of predetermining how these things can go, do you find it easier to give those kinds of consistent negative low-level consequences in a digital setting when these things are predetermined and I guess the players can't argue with the GM that's not there about why these bad things are happening to them? Because it's not being a killer game master, it is making an interesting story and telling the story through multiple facets. Do you find it easier to put those in there and like feel good about those choices in locking them into something like Citizen Sleeper versus, yeah, just running people through a game at a table?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be brave, I think, with games to make those kind of choices. Like, definitely, there's a couple of things in the game where, like, I had feedback from people where they were like, I don't like this, that I can't choose this here. And I was like, that's good, because that's what I want.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Like, I want you to feel that powerlessness there. So, in that specific moment, in relation to that specific character. And I am actually a total seat of my pants type GM. But what I love to have is just to have a lot of bits and pieces scattered around. Like I like to
Mm.
have a map laid out of there's a person over here and a person over here, and each of them has like a few descriptors, and that's it. And if the players don't cross paths with that person, then it means I can just throw them in the bin or they can come back later. But if they do, I've just got just enough to spark my imagination. And then when I hear what the player's doing, I'm like, oh, you're giving me ideas right now. Okay, I'm going to bounce off you. And I like to run like that. And so
Yeah.
actually, even though I couldn't run like that, I tried to design the game like that. So I did try to keep characters kind of around, like come up with ideas for characters, put them, know where they were going to appear on the map. But because you can play any of the storylines pretty much in any order, apart from the ones that kind of auto jump on you at the start of the game, like
Of
Fang,
course.
Yeah.
but you can still stop at any point and not
Yeah.
continue that plot line. So because they can be played in any order, I kind of treated them like that. Like, okay, this person over here, they have these qualities. And when I was writing them, I wasn't like, okay, I know where this plot's going. I know where it's going to end. Instead, I was like, okay, I know that this is a mercenary who's been betrayed by their crew and they need to fix their ship. And I know that's stage one. I don't know where we go from there. I
Hmm.
then like built that in. I played it myself. I kind of looked at it. I was like, okay, where's interesting to go next? But I knew that I had material kind of set up in the background. I knew I had kind of qualities there. And so stuff started to emerge as I worked. And I was like, okay, yeah, what does it mean to, I started kind of asking myself, okay, what does it mean to be a mercenary? Like, who is a mercenary? What kind of person is a mercenary? And I was like, oh, there's this interesting game I can play here with the player where I can present them with somebody that they might instantly be like, oh, that seems like a good person. But then it's also like, yeah, but think about it for a second. What do they do? They're a hired soldier. What does that mean? And how does
Mhm.
that mean they relate to you? And just kind of playing out these decisions
Hmm.
as I designed the game was a big part of it. So yeah, I'm not a big like plotter. I think there's a certain quality to tabletop storytelling anyway, which feels different to the storytelling of like a detective novel or whatever. It's not about kind of many perfect details aligning. It's instead about like big moments of
Hmm.
kind of like things smashing together, almost in surprising ways. And so I wanted to try and preserve that sense of liveness to the game, even if it's not a live game.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the characters, because the characters in this game are some of the best written characters I think I've ever experienced in an RPG ever.
Real good.
Like
Oh,
from the art design to how they talk, all of it. Like I immediately have a voice in my head for all of these characters. Sometimes I assign a celebrity voice or like a friend of mine. Like I have voices, and like the story you're talking about that I'm not going to spoil, but you work with this mercenary who is trying to repair her ship, and then the story takes this weird turn, and I got to a point where you have to make a choice, and like it was gutting, and like it was brilliantly written, and I was completely blindsided by it, because like you said, you can write these characters to appear kind and like needing help, and everyone in this game needs help. Like somehow you're the person who just stumbled into needing to help all these people, and like there are charismatic characters like Fang who just kind of grabs you by the wrist and goes, let's go, I got plans. And then there are other characters who are like, you're slowly getting to know, and then they throw a curveball because you turn out they have these not necessarily heinous purposes, but like they're out for revenge, or like even the character Ethan I mentioned before who's hunting you. That story even takes a complicated turn that I wasn't expecting, and I love that. I imagine character diversity was always at the forefront of your mind, and trying to make all these characters feel unique and feel different. What is it like to write all of these characters, especially with no VO? It's all text. Like, how did you curate those voices? Were you inspired by other characters from other medium?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I think I was inspired by just a love of science fiction generally to just try to pull on all of the kind of interesting threads that I like in science fiction. So, like, yeah, stories about bounty hunters, stories about chefs, I love stories about cooking, and I love writing about cooking. So I wanted to bring that in. And
Yeah.
I love bars in science fiction. I love
yeah.
them as meeting points, and kind of like also this idea of like how they cut through different groups, and so you can have different people in the same space. And and then like the shipyards and like industrial labor and like salvage. So I was just pulling on like all this stuff that I think is cool from sci-fi, but then I wanted to, rather than just kind of do that like grab bag thing, I wanted to then like try to engage with, okay, but what do these things mean in this world? Or the kind of structure of like, this is a world where we're taking kind of labor and precarity and the experience of being on the edge of society and in a system which doesn't care for you very seriously. So then what is a bounty hunter in that structure? What is a mercenary in that structure? What is a chef in that structure? What is a barman in that structure? Like how are these things coming in? So I had these kind of like top line ideas for, okay, I want a character there. And then I just started to pull at kind of, I don't know, looks I thought were interesting, and send material to Guillaume, the character artist.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would send me back these amazing sketches. Like you can see them in the art book on Steam, but like this kind of like range of different sketches. And sometimes it was like a big range, and I was like, oh, okay, well, and sometimes it took us a while to define them. Or sometimes he sent me back like 3 sketches, and it would just like number 2. Number 2 is the one. That's them. They're going in straight in the game.
Yeah.
But then I would look at that character, and then I would be able to draw from that character and write a bit more. And maybe we'd kind of then say, oh yeah, let's add this little detail in here. Or there was a lot of focus on kind of the costuming and the individual objects that people are carrying with them and the things that they can express. But Guillaume has like an incredible attention to detail for that kind of thing. He's very good at kind of picking up on like, when we came up with all kinds of fun ideas about the kind of things people would carry in this environment and what they have access to and what they don't. So it just kind of became deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I set out these archetypes at the beginning, but then like kept coming back to them over the course of development. And I think that allowed each one of them to kind of define their own voice. And I used some tricks, there's some characters call you specific things or use specific catchphrases or talk in different kind of vernaculars, just to kind of try to amp up that feeling of a voice, because I just knew that this game would live or die on the ability of people to like catch on to a character. My feeling was always, I get one scene, you'll meet every character once. Pretty much every player will meet every character once, and I need to sell that character in that scene so that if a player is interested in them, that's like they get a clear picture. And if they're not, then they'll also get a clear picture. But I thought of each of those scenes as like a kind of pitch scene for the character. And that's why I tried to think about like, also, what are those scenes like Ankita like grabbing you and saying like, hey, do you want a little bit of money to help me drag these things through? And then she just kind of disappears off like carrying a huge pile of plates. And so that immediately said, okay, like, one, money is going to be an issue or like a theme here, like being paid for work is like a thing. And it's like a fun little dramatic irony plant at the beginning that like, she chucks you a coin essentially. That's me being tricky, like hinting at things. But then also it's like, you immediately get a sense, okay, like this person is kind of like incredibly focused and like, yeah, they're massive and they can carry this huge weight of scrap, and they're kind of like also a bit sarcastic or like hard to reach. But yeah, and like just immediately sell that versus like Tala, for example, who's like saves you from a bad situation, and immediately you get the sense of like, oh, Tala's someone who pays attention to the people around her. She's someone who's kind of like in touch with the people who are coming and leaving the bar, and she also is like an obvious ally, right? She
Yeah.
immediately is like, I'm your ally. Like, you need me, come to me, I will help you. And so yeah, just trying to kind of like have those fun little scenes that would get people on the hook for each of the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I love that also because, like, Tala, for example, I've barely interacted with because I don't drink. And so, like,
Right,
I
right.
haven't gone into the bar. It's affected my character, which is really brilliant. I hadn't thought of that till now. I do want to talk about the setting a little bit. You know, I can't imagine where you would pull inspiration for dystopia, overwhelmed by corporations and feeling the crush of capitalism. I can't imagine where you were inspired by that from. But like, I think what's really interesting about Citizen Sleeper, especially with the sleepers, is this idea of selling your consciousness to a corporation and then they can put it in other bodies. Like, at first I was like, oh, okay, I get it. You're just a robot. It's fine. And then, like, as the game goes on, you're like, no, you have the memories of this other person, but you are clearly not this other person. And like that haunting idea that you could be so desperate that you sell your consciousness to make money, and now these other beings have to live with it. Also, the classes, like I played as an extractor. Jeff, you played as an operator. Is that correct?
Yes. Sorry, it's been a little while since I looked at the class choice, like the middle choice.
That was operator, yeah. And like,
Operator, yeah.
what I love about the way you design these classes, there's only 3, and like they have one perk and one negative, but you really give the players the opportunity to make the characters their own. Like that starting point is akin to me to most recently like Elden Ring. Like you pick a starting class, but you can kind of build whatever you want. Was that always the clear goal? Like I want to give them a good place to focus from the get, but like I want them to have full customization.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in part, it's also a scale issue. That like the game is supposed to be kind of lightweight, and the vast majority of the game is made by just me. So like the idea of making 3 completely unique character classes is a little challenging. But I also, it's hard to give people a choice at the start of the game, which then like locks them into like, let's say, a skill tree or whatever, because they really don't. There's so much in Citizen Sleeper which I don't want to explain. I
Right.
want to like let people find it as they go, and so it felt wrong to say the class choice is important, but it's actually not that important from a mechanical perspective. You can easily like respec to any class, and if you want to play everything in the game, you can kind of unlock every perk and work your way up. And so instead, you were right. Like my intention was to get people to come into the game with like a sense of what was I doing as a sleeper, to just like set that up right at the beginning as a kind of like, instead of telling that story to the player, just letting them choose that story. Like, was I the kind of person who was like fixing these? Was I alone on an asteroid, like fixing these robots, and the robots were going down to the mine and like digging stuff up, and all I was doing was kind of like tending to their wounds and like looking after them and kind of like feeling isolated? Or was I an extractor? Was I like in the mine? Was I there with like a group of other people, like a tight knit group of other sleepers, like cutting away and kind of doing the hard labor? Like what, just try and give a sense. And really, we worked a lot on those story portraits as well to just try and think about what might attract players to certain types of sleeper, and then also to just show people immediately like, oh, this is what a sleeper looks like, so that people from the beginning would be like, I know what I look like, and I know what a sleeper is. I know it's a kind of robot at the very least. So even if they don't clock everything that happens at once, they're like, oh yeah, I can see that's a robot, and I can see that's kind of like, I don't know what gender that robot is. It's kind of just a person robot. And also like, okay, I can see that the extractor is kind of standoffish and damaged and carrying this like big welding torch, while I can see that the machinist is deep into some kind of repair work, right? It's just an immediate like a gut check, like, oh, does that seem like me? And then also the same with the skills, right? It's like, well, I've got a strong sense of endurance, but yeah, I'm not very intuitive. It's just like immediately kind of says something about who you're going to decide to be on the station, because there's so many choices then to make when you hit the game about what jobs you do, what characters you follow. So it felt like it was important to prep the player so that for certain kinds of players, especially players more experienced with RPGs, they'd be able to maybe like fall back on, oh, well, I know I'm not very intuitive, so yeah, like maybe this, or like, oh, I'm actually a machinist, I don't engage with people very well, so I'm not going to work a bar shift, because like, or when they do come to work a bar shift, there's like a fun narrative there, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm actually not good at this because I'm much better. I'd much rather be like soldering together an engine than I would be like trying to make conversation with this person right now.
And that services a lot of different kinds of RPG players. Some role players really like leaning into their weaknesses. And I can definitely say that at the outset, having just that little bit of slight differences in who you are playing and what class you are, you start off, you feel very desperate. You feel very, where am I? Who am I? What am I? And you look at the different jobs that are there. And I definitely felt like, okay, there's a lot of information coming at me. Okay, these things, engineering is good. These things, enduring is good. Well, I'm an operator, so let's engineer for a little while and just kind of take care of that. Then I started leaning into some bad ideas, but I wanted to at least get a feel for things. And just with those very slight shifts, yeah, you're right. It becomes a little easier to then make the choices that you as a player want to make.
Yeah, totally. I think that I started this game kind of just happy-go-lucky. Like, I'm going to make some choices. Let's see what happens. And there's never really a wrong choice. There's just choices that have consequences, which I love. You're talking to someone who's a Mass Effect obsessive. I have a podcast about Mass Effect. So, like, games...
You're wearing a Paragon shirt right now.
I am, yes. So, like, you give me an opportunity to make choices, but don't... Like, I don't mind the Paragon Renegade system, like you said, but like in Andromeda, it's just a reaction system, right? You just react to moments, which is very different. I like that in this game, you can make choices in the moment. I also love, and this is something that I don't see in a lot of RPGs ever, is, there's the silent protagonist who doesn't speak, but they clearly react, like Mario and Super Mario RPG, Cloud a lot of the time in Final Fantasy and things like that. Like, they don't talk a lot, but they're not actually silent. In this, you can choose to stay silent through most, if not all, conversations. I find that fascinating because then people are just like, for example, I don't think Fang would ever notice you not talk. Like, Fang is the kind of character that's going to do what he wants and string you along. But then there are other characters like Ankita and like, even later on characters that not talking could be a real detriment, but then they have to figure out what to do with it. What is it like to write that kind of dialogue? Because it's a monologue at that point.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a delicate thing in the game because it again comes back to this feeling of I really wanted the characters to have agency way more than video game characters usually have, and I didn't want them to be easy to push around. And at the same time, I also felt like there was something emerged in the game, which is the arc of kind of what kind of sleeper are you? Are you the kind of sleeper who's like, still a human? Like, what are you guys talking about? Even if I have this, and then, or are you the kind of sleeper who's like, yeah, you guys are all like weird flesh people, and I am actually an ascended form of life, or whatever. Like, this idea of kind of just like, I don't know, it's kind of like it can be a very strong choice in life to not say anything, but it's one we're rarely offered.
Yeah.
And I felt like in the situation of where you're under pressure, where everything's kind of coming in on you, it's like just kind of saying nothing has a lot of meaning. It both can suggest like the idea of like, well, I'm just head down. I don't want to engage with you right now. But it can also mean like, I'm not going to be moved by you. Like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm comfortable. I'm not going to be goaded into debating whether or not I should exist or, anything like this, right? So I wanted to play that delicate game, but I think it's just what I'm attracted to in role-playing games generally is like, I also love Mass Effect, but I think that for just my personal like feeling of things that I want to make, I'm just really interested in people who are like all tied up in a lot of, that are really in the world, that are really like connected to a lot of things and have a lot of pressures on them. And what decisions can you make? And so I was very interested in the small decisions as much as big decisions that you can make in this game. And decisions as small as just kind of not saying anything, or decisions like standing up for somebody and not really being like, oh yeah, and therefore, if you don't say something here, then like, the station is doomed. It's just like, no, if you don't say something here, you didn't say something there. Like that's it. Yeah. That's about your relationship. The dialogue in the game is a lot about your relationship to the characters and you playing that out for yourself than it is about me tracking everything that you're doing and kind of like trying to create a model of social behavior. Because that's also, to me, about respecting the characters, that I'm not creating like a little brain for each of them that's really just going to be a basic like plus or minus. Do they like you? Do they not? Instead, I wanted them to feel, sometimes unreachable or difficult to understand. And so it's like, well, yeah, I don't want to make it obvious and telegraph, they will remember that or not. I just want to leave that down to people to worry over when they're working a bar shift and they're thinking like, do I trust that person or do I not trust that person? Am I going to go back there or am I not going to go back there?
Well, and that's a very interesting contrast because at the start of this, we were talking about how having the dice rolls be more public to the viewer or to the one playing, it's such a refreshing change, and you can make those choices based on that. And yet you have obfuscated the social dynamics, whereas so many other games are absolutely, they will remember this, they will not remember this, Paragon, Renegade, anything else. And that's an interesting switch on things. Was that a conscious decision?
I guess I'm very interested in the play that happens between the computer and us, rather than all the play that happens in the systems that the game defines. And my first game was very much like that, in Other Waters, where you play as an AI inside the suit of a biologist, and you could only communicate by saying yes or no to questions that the biologist asked you. And so you have this incredibly monotone relationship. And from her perspective, it's like, oh, I'm kind of a, you could kind of feel that she thinks you're just like a functional AI, but you know that you're a sentient AI because you're sentient as a person.
Yeah.
And so these yes and no's carry so much weight, and you're also doing a lot of, like, I even watched people at like conventions and things play that game and like speak out loud to Ellery. They were saying yes and no, but they were like, okay, come on, Ellery, let's just shut up, let's go over here, or so there's like this off the table, off the game play like that happens between us. And I felt like that's something I wanted to encourage as well. So in a way, both of those tools do that. By obfuscating the social elements and having characters who have agency, I'm kind of trying to encourage the players to like try to reach those characters, and I'm trying not to give them everything they want, not to give them access to all the information at once, because I think that kind of kills the characters dead if they start to feel just like another object that's moving in the world.
You can't min-max it.
Yeah, exactly. And then the Dyson clocks are there to kind of create this abstraction where it's like, I'm just slotting a dice in an action, but there's text here which says that it's a bar shift, and I can see the outcomes, and it's up for the player to then like narrativize like what happened today. When I went to the bar and I had a bad shift, and then I was like, oh, screw it, and then I instead decided to not do any more work and go and help my friend like repair their ship, or like I really wanted the player to try and fill in all those gaps. And the trick with that is about leaving big enough gaps for people to fill, but also like leaving a lot of trails between them, like a lot of small mentions of things. So actions you take in the bar might occasionally give you a little bit more information about Tala, and so it's like I'm leaving like connective tissue everywhere to try and get people to narrativize, because I know that I can't do that work. There's no way I can like write,
Right.
and people wouldn't even want me to, but I don't want to, every time you roll a dice, you can't be like, okay, and so in today's bar shift, Tala came to you and said this, So I'm trying to encourage that play for the player in their mind.
Also, how dare you use Lem and Mina against me emotionally? Because the first time I met that man and his little girl, I was so charmed by her. And I immediately did all of the babysitting shifts in a row. And I did exactly that. Like, what does this humanoid robot do with this little girl when the father's not around to like entertain her? Is she like just sitting on his shoulders, banging on his head? Is she throwing things at him? Are they playing tag? Like, I absolutely envisioned that because it's just the writing was so good. I wanted to fill in those gaps. It was so adorable. But you manipulated me with an adorable child, and I won't stand for it.
It's funny as well, just to talk about that a little bit more, is that like I was very inspired by episodic narratives in this game, and especially like Deep Space Nine and shows like this. And I feel like when you watch something like Deep Space Nine, you know that you're not seeing every scene between these characters, right? There are implied other scenes that happen because we can see the relationship is pointing to that. So, for example, with like Lem and Mina and the babysitting, it's like we go from a scene where like Lem kind of foists Mina onto you, and you kind of like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with this child. And then you do the babysitting actions, and then the scene you have between you and Lem implies that there is a relationship there between you and Mina. But I never have to show that scene, right? Because it's like you've done the dice rolls, you've had the two scenes, you see the contrast, and it's like I'm able to tell that story. And that, that's something that like, happens in almost every, even in Friends, it's like we know that we're not seeing every bit of their friendship. We're just seeing the scenes the show wants to show us. So this system definitely really allowed me to also create like invisible narrative that people could imagine. Like you're saying, like, I love this image of Mina like sitting on the sleeper's head and just being like, where's my daddy?
As someone who has worked with children for many years, the experience of just being orbited by a screaming child is so real, but they're having fun.
Yeah. I mean, so the funny thing as well with Lem and Mina is I have a daughter, and a lot of that is based on my life. And so in a way, like I didn't, it sounds silly, but I didn't try to also just be like, oh, let's just like twist the player's arm with
Yeah.
like a kind of heartfelt story. I genuinely was like, this is something I am interested personally in exploring, like and I'm especially interested in care, I guess, in the game. And so I really like this idea of, this is something I noticed as a parent as well, is like this idea of like care that doesn't benefit you, right? It doesn't. And so I really wanted actions in the game that were not about making money. And I wanted to like also put that pressure a bit on the player and kind of say like, hey, you could use that energy to make money, or you could like go and babysit a kid, and the reward for that is like questionable, like
Right.
we'll see. But like we all make those choices, and yeah, like playing the mechanical against the narrative is also like a fun game to play with the player.
Well, also in those sort of lived spaces of sci-fi, certainly, where you aren't necessarily on a biome, on a planet or anything like that. You have the space you have, like you were mentioning about the art of characters, what are they carrying? Because you can only have so much space and things. There is such I love the exploration of cutthroat capitalism versus community caring, to get really alliterative about the whole thing. As you said, that you can hustle and grind and make the money and get the cryo and do everything that you need to do, but you interact with people, and when all you can take with you is what you can carry, and as can everyone else, the people around you are infinitely more important than you realize. And I could definitely see that kind of weaved throughout the narrative and throughout the idea, even if it never bashes you over the head with it, was having that kind of community matters. Was that like a philosophical thesis that you held on to while kind of putting this together? Or was it more of a, well, it makes sense, we'll put this here and let people draw their conclusions?
So, I mean, that stuff is like really personal for me in terms of coming from my experience working gig jobs and being unemployed and kind of like, and
Yeah.
I think when you work for, so I worked for like employment agencies that would also just like phone me up and be like, hey, come to this bar. And then you come to the bar and then no one would know why you're at the bar. And then they were like, oh, you're agency staff. Oh, just like go over here and don't talk to me. But then you meet somebody else who's also agency staff, and then and you have a great night with that person and you never see them again, even though you're on the same agency or whatever. So I think when you're exposed to a lot of risk and a lot of precarity in life, people become very important to you. And also, you tend to meet a lot of different people in a way. Like, I don't know, like if you have a stable, well paying office job, I think you just meet the same set of people, right? While if
Yeah.
you're like running all over the city, trying to get different jobs, like you're kind of trying to make things balance, you run into all kinds of different people. And I worked in loads of jobs where, in a way, like there were also like little micro groups. I remember I worked in they opened a Ripley's, believe it or not, in London, which ultimately failed. Turned out nobody likes Ripley's in the UK.
We don't love
I
it
don't know
here
if they
either.
like it in America. Yeah,
Not really.
Not really.
But that was a museum. It was like weird because I guess because of the nature of Ripley's, but it was open until like midnight
Right.
in central London. And so I used to finish shifts at midnight in central London, and you don't want to go home after being on a shift, so you just go and find a bar that's open. But the people who go to a bar after work at midnight, it's like a specific group of people. There were like bicycle couriers. There were like croupiers from the casinos. There were people who like rode the rickshaws around London that kind of like ferry tourists around, like blasting dance music and stuff like this. And like suddenly you had like all these like it's a specific group of people. And while I worked that job, it's like I met so many people who you just you'd never run into. You'd never see that side of London. Like London's kind of like night people in there, and it's like your whole lifestyle adapts to being in that space. And then other times, you take jobs where you have to get up at 5:30 in the morning, you take the first train of the day, and you see the people who take the first train of the day, right? And most people don't see those ends of how a city works and how it functions. So I'm super interested in that. All of that experience had a huge effect on me and how I see cities and people more generally. And so there is a kind of philosophical element to it, because I definitely believe that the only way that we can exist in like extreme risk and precarity is to have a community, is to have intimacy with other people and to build mutual aid. But from another perspective, it is just also coming directly from my experience and me trying to make sci-fi that like means something to me and relates to me, is not just like a story about a hero who flies off and saves the galaxy, and that can be cool, but it doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't touch me.
Yeah. I mean, those like we're talking about Mass Effect, like the reason Shepard resonates is because it's more than just running off and saving the world.
Oh, totally.
And I think that like, so Jeff and I both are familiar with gig life, both of us working in and around shows, themes in New York. I'm a DJ, and I used to host and help with DJ burlesque shows, and so like that late night life,
cool.
like doing a show till 2 a.m. and then getting on the train and seeing someone who's clearly like been out a while or maybe just got out and you're not sure, and so like you definitely feel that in this game. I love this world, and I've spent so much less time in it than other games I've played. Like within the first couple of missions and conversations, you know what this world is, and you only learn more as it goes. But that gig side of it, like the first thing you do is you do a job like clearing up scrap, and it's like, yeah, you want to keep helping, I'll give you more money. Like, and like, oh, okay, I like more money, I need more money. Like,
I need this.
It gets you really quick. I'm curious a little bit, to shift gears a bit, about your gaming past. Obviously, we talked about the tabletop influence, but did you grow up playing a lot of video games as a kid? Were there favorite games of yours that we could possibly see inspiring Citizen Sleeper? Or just what were some of your favorite games growing up?
Yeah, I played a lot of games as a kid. The game that really got me when I was, I think it was probably 8 or 9 years old, was Pokemon Blue. Because before then, I didn't know RPGs existed as video games, and I hadn't really, like, games to me were like playing a level of Sonic at a friend's house, which was cool, but it was like, sure. That's like, it's like throwing stones at a window, it's like, I'm not getting much, like, it looks cooler, but it's not much more I'm getting out of it than that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I played Pokemon, I was like, oh, this is like a kid with a house and parents, and it's, I was living in a rural area, and it's like, oh, this is rural as well, but it's also a fantasy, and it's like, I can relate to this, but also it's like, yeah, it's encouraging me to inhabit this character and kind of think like, oh, what kind of Pokemon are in my team? Am I like a kind of bug guy, or like what am I into? Like, where do I go? Who do I talk to? And yeah, I was just like really enamored with that. And then I just really got into Nintendo games and was a big GameCube teenager and just loved those games. But I think that for me, like, Citizen Sleeper is not necessarily, I mean, it is inspired by games, but it's also very much inspired by the science fiction novels I was reading.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Especially Alistair Reynolds, who's like this wonderful science fiction kind of split between hard sci-fi and kind of like wild sci-fi, because he worked for the ESA, like European Space Agency, and so he knows like how physics works, but then he also writes kind of crazy stories about like, one of the things in his story is like a melding plague, which is like this machine disease that makes machines like reproduce themselves, like tumors, kind of like, and this infects like a society, like a post-human incredible future city that's kind of like was all perfect and utopian, or at least like filled with power and technology, and then it basically grows into like this insane tumor city, and then like people have to use kind of steampunk technology there because it's immune to the disease. But he's doing this while he's also being like, but I've got accurate faster than light travel calculations or whatever. So
just flexing on us, of course.
Yeah, exactly. But he wrote these massive books, and like, in this universe, and I really loved this feeling of like a big interconnected universe that felt really deep and filled with different kind of types of relations between groups and people. I mean, I really got into Star Wars when I was a kid, but not through the films. I got into it through like a little CD-ROM that I think was called like Behind the Magic or something. It was like an extended universe thing. Like, it had some, I think you could like test weapons on stormtroopers, and it was just like loads of little bits of video and things.
I am looking this up right now.
Yeah. But I just understood, like, that's how I understood Star Wars, like in the beginning, as just like a space that you could tell stories in. And I spent more time like buying random short story extended universe collections, right? And being really I was way more into the story of some random character who was like used to be a scout trooper and then became a bounty hunter, and then who only features in this like one extended universe short story that's about 50 pages long. I was way more into that character than Luke Skywalker. Like, I was really into all these kind of weird little stories about different people that might happen in this world. All those books that have now been burned by Disney, unfortunately.
I am still so mad about that. Yeah. I grew up reading so many Star Wars novels. I had the essential guides to all like characters, planets, ships, weapons. Yeah. No, like I have never seen Behind the Magic before, and I might need to get this.
It'd probably be disappointing, I imagine. But so like another case is like the cross sections books, right? Like, I was absolutely so into those, and it was only later that I realized like a Star Destroyer was just a big triangle because it looked cool. But when you looked at like those cross-section books, somebody had to fill in the gaps, right? Like
Yeah.
some incredible artist who did those, basically they told him like, yeah, you've got to figure out why the hell a Star Destroyer is this shape. Like what is in there? And they had to just invent a load of like little things to fill that gap. And I think that's how I relate to sci-fi. Like these kind of like big spaces where there's all these gaps and all these things going on, and I was always kind of looking over the shoulders of characters to try and see like what's happening in the market, like get out the way, Luke, like who's that guy in the cantina like with a weird devil face, and like what's his deal?
The Deveronian, yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea of filling in the gaps. I mean, I think the reason, like games that we've mentioned before in this episode, like Mass Effect and things that are especially in the sci-fi spaces, you want to know about the world, not just the character. And I think that's what's so great about Citizen Sleeper is not only is the character you're playing interesting because you're the character, it's a vessel for you, but so are the characters you interact with and the world you interact with. Like the design of the space station itself also, like talking about filling in those gaps, is this giant circle that like as you play, you discover more areas, but you have to work to unlock those areas. So you could completely miss them in theory, some of them. Totally. And like there was one where I totally didn't realize like there's this elevator section that takes you up to like another small area for like probably 2 hours more than it should have. It took me to realize that I could unlock that and then go into that area and do another thing. Was that just as fun to design the complexity of this place and creating this physical space for these characters to be?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I love that side of things, science fiction architecture, and I especially love like urban sci-fi.
Yeah.
And I think this game is me kind of trying, like my favorite Mass Effect game is Mass Effect 2, and I love all of the like city planets in that game.
Yeah.
And I love the kind of atmosphere you get of there's all of this stuff going on, right? It's just the same feeling when you live in a city and you like stand on a balcony or someone's fire escape or whatever, and you look out and you see all the lights and you see all the movement, and you're like, there's so many stories here, there's so much going on here, and I'm somehow part of that. And so that feeling, I think, in science fiction can be really cool. And so I really wanted to make a space that had that feeling of density. But I also spent a lot of time experimenting with different designs in the beginning. So I like at one point the game was set on a space elevator and you would kind of like scroll up it. So because I really like this idea, you could scroll from like the planet's surface into orbit, but it was a bit impractical because it's kind of like to do that in any reasonable way, it's a very long way to scroll. But like I played about with kind of setting it on like just a tower in a city, and you would it's like the tower that people come and land at when they're coming from like off world, and then they come and they arrive on this tower and then they go off into the city, but you're isolated to this tower, you never get out or in. Maybe there are people right down in the city who you don't want to go back down there because they'll get you, but you're trying to make enough money to like get on a ship and leave, so you're kind of stuck in the port. So I played with all these different structures that I thought would be interesting, but also looking at kind of the visual, like what would be the image that people are going to stare at, because I needed people to really want to like put themselves inside it, because I knew I wouldn't be able to put the player like push them through the window and actually like show them an interior. I knew I'd just have character art. And so I ended up with this. Once I kind of like hit on a ring station, I just did this quick thing where I hooked up the mouse wheel to the ring, and then I did that and I was like, okay, that's it, I'm here now. Like this is such an interesting interaction and a fun way of the world kind of revealing itself to you. And then I just kind of followed the implications that came with that, that like, okay, the way, we create gravity with a ring station means that we have this rotating exterior, but then we have this central hub that doesn't have gravity and like is therefore good for docking, and kind of like just trying to like play out all of these structures that, are implied by this kind of station. So yeah, I had so much fun like designing all the little buildings and things like that, and kind of sticking like weird greebles on the side of things and kind of like getting the right level of detail. Yeah, it was really fun.
At what point do you know that it's enough detail? Is it because of deadlines and practicality, or is it just, or do you have a thing of like, and that's enough?
So the funny thing is that when I first made the game, I made the like the rotunda was like the first thing I made. I made it like insanely detailed, and I had like decals on it and like extra textures and stuff like this. And I was still going for this kind of hand-drawn anime background kind of feel. But as I worked on the game, I actually realized like I need less and less detail because the game worked better when there was a lot of clarity. And I kind of tried to push more towards that comic side of things with the 3D art as well. And so actually I went back and like removed a load of detail, and the game doesn't actually have any textures in it at all. It's just completely raw 3D. It's just the way the shaders handle it and the way the lighting handles it. So yeah, it was kind of like a funny process that in a way, I think this happens a lot in visual art anyway, is like you can just like go crazy, like adding detail, but the more detail you add, you often lose some kind of like quality that's hard to recreate.
Yeah.
It's so often that you'll do a sketch and then you'll try to like clean it up, and it's like, oh, I liked it before, like when it was a potential thing rather than when it's a finished thing. So yeah, just trying to balance those two.
So I'm playing it on the Switch, and I love my OLED. It looks gorgeous on the OLED.
Mm.
And so I don't know how it runs on other consoles, but what I love about Citizen Sleeper is that there's a little bit of a long load up time when you first turn it on and jump into the game. But then after that, almost nothing. It autosaves seamlessly. There's no lag. There's no stutter. I'm guessing that was also very important to you. You wanted a game that was, once you kind of booted it up, it was kind of a smooth ride. And I imagine adding all of those details would have hindered that experience, right? The kind of more base level kind of practical version is the one that would run the best.
Oh, totally, yeah. And it's also about the scope of the game and designing it as like a small, basically one-person studio. I mean, all the 3D art is done by me, all the writing is done by me, all the programming is done by me. So it's kind of like, yeah, those, to make the game in under 2 years, which was the kind of plan, to make like something lightweight and fast that allowed me to tell stories quickly, was kind of the thing that I wanted to do. So yeah, there's a limit where you're like, but yeah, it was interesting. I was expecting to do way more of the 3D, but like to have to tell more of that. But I just found like as the game settled, as the tech settled in and the art settled in as well, it's like I didn't actually need that. The game was kind of telling the story enough. But yeah, and that single location thing is like a big part of the game as well. It's like, yeah, I really wanted it to be, like you say, that you like, okay, we have to have a long load time because we're literally loading like this massive space station and everything else into the game. But when you're loaded in, it's like, okay, you're free to go, you're free to wander this city and kind of like pick a story and pick up from where you left off. And we're not going to have like a travel section where you go from one bit to another. It's like, I want to keep the pressure on, and I want to keep the feeling, the density of being in a city there.
Yeah, it works really well. It's truly a phenomenal game and easily one of my favorite games of the year so far.
Thank you.
Like, I was excited for it and it didn't disappoint on any level. So it's just an impressive creation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I could talk to you probably for another hour about this, and now I have to tell you about my Mass Effect podcast, but we can save that for another time. But I would love for you to tell folks where they can find the game, where they can find you online, and like where the best way is to interact with you and Citizen Sleeper.
Sure. So yeah, you can find Citizen Sleeper on Steam, on Mac and PC, or you can find it on Xbox. It's on Game Pass. It's also on Nintendo Switch. And you can find me on Twitter at JumpOverTheAge, which is the best place to send me your bugs or fan art. And you can also find the game at Citizen Sleeper on Twitter. And yeah, you can find my older game, In Other Waters, if you're interested in digging into the past, at In Other Waters on Twitter. And yeah, search In Other Waters on Steam to find that. It's also on Switch.
Yeah, I've already, right before we started talking, I favorited that on Switch. So that's my next purchase because the idea that you're an AI that can only say yes or no is fascinating to me. So I'm definitely going to check that out. Well, again, Gareth, thank you so much for joining us. This was delightful. We're going to wrap up the show, so just hang tight for a sec. All of y'all who are listening, if you have not played Citizen Sleeper yet, it is on Game Pass. Like, there are plenty of ways to buy it, but also if you want to try it first, which is often a thing I do with Game Pass, go jump in. It's there. It's a great game. It's definitely worth checking out. If you have played it, what do you think of it? Let us know. Tweet at us, tweet at Gareth. Let us know what you thought of the game. What was your favorite character? Why is it Fang? All of those great details. Interact with us. We'd love to hear what you think of this incredible game.
Yeah, and if all of this discussion has made you worry about it being a super long, super crazy game, it's less than 10 hours. It is such an incredible experience to have. And what are your thoughts on a lived sci-fi world? What are your thoughts on the sense of self and AI and consciousness? And we want to hear from you about all of that and about the aspects of what you can discover in games and the density of the spaces that you explore. You can reach out to us across social media, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us all at funandgamespod. You can go to certainpov.com to find not only this show, but so many other fantastic podcasts on our network, as well as a permanent invite link to our Discord server where we discuss games, we discuss comics, movies, TV shows, and whatever other wild things we want to do, sharing gifts and, just generally being weird. It's great.
Also, if you got a moment, please give us a rating and a review on your podcast platform of choice, especially Apple Podcasts. It helps us get into the feeds of other incredible podcasts and helps more people discover the show. If this show inspires you to go buy Citizen Sleeper, please tell us. We'd love to know. We can pass it along to Gareth. You can tell Gareth yourself. And again, thank you for joining us on this ride. It's been a blast. Again, Gareth, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you for joining us for this conversation about everything, and thank all of you listeners for letting us know if you've played the game, what you think of the game, and being part of all of the other conversations we have, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't Screen Beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
Writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry.
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not.
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans.
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
'Cause you're all Screen Beans now.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.